One of the biggest differences between my current work, working for a peace and reconciliation organization, as opposed to my previous job, which was a more outward face of speaking out against human rights abuses, is that it is more discreet in a way. Even though most people in the UN are obliged to just refrain from speaking out, even when they see pretty awful things, when you have the human rights mandate, as I did, then it's more understood that you can speak out against atrocities and other threats to human rights. When you're working on behind the scenes to promote mediation or peace building at grassroots level, it's certainly something that is less encouraged, because you're going to break the trust that you're trying to build up between warring parties, most of whom, of course, do carry out terrible human rights violations. So if your aim is to get them to talk, first of all, to you and then to the other side, then calling them out for what they're doing is the wrong way to go about it. Essentially, after the Second World War, the powers came together and prepared and largely agreed on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was, and it covered the whole spectrum of rights, because it not only was it looking back at the just finished genocide and massive destruction of war, but it was also looking back slightly further to the Great Depression. So human rights, as they should, were seen as covering economic and social rights, as well as political and civil and cultural. But very soon after that, the worlds were split, and the communist world put much more focus on social and economic rights, whereas the Western world focused much more on individual and civil and political rights. And there was a dialogue of the deaf in some ways, and not that much progress was made for the next 30 years or so. But by the late 70s, increasingly there was an understanding that one needed to do more. I would say that started unraveling, or at least the progress was halted with the response to the terrible attacks in New York in September 2001. This led a number of governments to decide that fighting terrorism was the only really important thing to be doing, and if human rights of either the people responsible or even just people who got in the way were less important matters to be considered. But terrible crimes were committed both by terrorists and by people who said they were fighting a great war against terrorism. So one has seen a rise in the last few years, and this is where it's got really dangerous. And I would say that at no point since the Second World War has there been such as a global pushback in so many places against the very concept of human rights, and therefore an acceptance of major violations. But even before we had this global catastrophe, we were seeing this pushback manifesting itself in so many different ways. We have, with the growth of the power of China and increased repression and intolerance towards any dissension, whether it's among the Uyghurs and the concentration camps that house well over 1 million people, we believe, but they will not give anyone access to actually go and look at them, and in the crushing of dissent and political space in Hong Kong, combined with something that we've never seen before, the technological means of surveilling people and watching everything they do, every aspect of whatever they look at on their internet, and being able to record in ways that, Stalin could never do. Record all your actions, and they're being put down in and registered as whether you're a good citizen or not. So there are very, very advanced forms of repression, and a government in the form of China that is very willing to advance them. Meanwhile, you have in the United States an administration that literally not at any point in its history is so aggressive towards human rights. It is almost as if the Trump administration is waging a war against human rights in the same way as they're waging a war against the environment. It is pushing back in every aspect, whether it's migration, whether it is the rights of, you can see Black Lives Matter, the glorification of torture by the president himself, the glorification of the statues of people who were fighting to defend the institution of slavery. So there is a pushback and an undermining of press, continually attacking press freedoms and mocking the press, attacking the rule of law, which is an essential aspect of human rights. So in many parts of the world, you have this pushback and this rise, not just in the United States, but in countries of Europe and India elsewhere, the rise of populist regimes who almost invariably try to find a group that is to be a scapegoat, to be blamed for the ills of society, whether it's Mexican migrants in the United States or whether it is Muslims in India. In country after country, you'll find people looking for scapegoats who almost invariably were before that the most marginalized, excluded groups and vulnerable, and are now being targeted for pretty bad stuff going on. Naturally, there is a link between economic depression and political instability and growth of intolerance. We saw that after the Great Depression of 1929, which was, I think, an essential condition for the rise of fascism and Nazism in the 30s. We have seen now I believe that the recession of 2008, the stock market crash and the subsequent recession, 2008, 2009, was a major part of the backlash against human rights that we are seeing around the world today. Similarly, it leads to, as people become more economically threatened, they lash out at people who they think may be competitors, and it is easy for populists on Fox News in the United States, for example, or elsewhere, to try to whip up hatreds and to tell white people, for example, that they are under threat from black people or from Muslims or from Central Americans. And we have clearly seen that over the last few years. And it has played a major role in the rise of Trump and the worst aspects, the most hostile aspects to minorities that we see there. So cultural factors play a major role. I think there is no doubting that. Culture is inextricably linked to social cohesion and human rights. And I mean, in the same way as good weather is linked to agricultural yields and farming, and bad weather likewise. It can be, if the culture that is promoted and accepted and tolerated is one that plays on negative stereotypes, tries to again scapegoat a minority, to claim that X or Y is a security threat to either our nation, is a threat either to our security or to our cultural identity, that is extremely dangerous. Culture has always played a role both in making things better and in making things worse. And there's no correlation necessarily between good culture and bad culture. After all, let us face it, the Nazi regime were great admirers of the works of Wagner and of Beethoven and Bach. I mean, they were, I think one would like to think that great music, for example, is a means of softening the soul. But in all too many cases, just last month in July, we had the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, the worst massacre in Europe since the Second World War. And yet one of the architects of that, Radovan Karadzic, was well known for his love of Mozart. So culture doesn't have to Alas, great culture doesn't have to have a beneficial effect, but it can do. On the other hand, we have seen culture can, and the people and cultural leaders can play a tremendously important role in reducing the social divisiveness and in reducing human rights abuses. To take, for example, in Germany, where I'm now living, we have Daniel Barenboim set up the East-West Divan Orchestra for Israelis and Arab musicians to play together, to get to know one another. That is a vital way of allowing people from different, indeed warring, political and cultural backgrounds to come together. We also saw how Kurt Masur, who was a great conductor in Leipzig at the end of the Cold War, played a vital role when the East German regime was falling in ensuring that the movements that were advancing on various places to try for East Germans to claim their human rights should stay peaceful, and moreover, that the falling communist regime should not use brutal force against them. Artists have an important role to play, sometimes perhaps less than they might imagine, but it's still an important role. And particularly those involved in sort of mass culture and with a large audience. But even smaller ones can help create an environment. How they can best work is to at least avoid presenting negative stereotypes. This has been, I think, often the case that culture, whether it's film or books, can either promote unity or it can do the opposite. For example, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel produced before the American Civil War, is regarded as having really woken up people in the northern states of the United States of America to the absolute horrors of slavery. So this work of fiction played a major role in ending one of the great injustices of all time, American slavery. Artists can portray things in a way that can create sympathy for people who are in desperate situations, as Dostoevsky's The House of the Dead, for example, or Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And these have an important impact. So the subject matter of artists and how they portray people, you can either try to flag injustices and shine a spotlight on injustices and to try to promote the rights of victims, or in the case of many other artists, I've recently been reading about Berlin, which is where I live at the moment, how actually artists in the late 19th century really did not grapple with the great social issues of their time to the detriment of, I think, everybody, because it actually helped push Germany into a situation of war with much of the rest of Europe, the First World War I'm talking about. So the role of artists is an important one, and they can either pick up an overtly political, but political from a humane sense, one that actually tries to minimize differences, tries to shine a spotlight on injustice, is one that I think is absolutely vital. The current pandemic is a source of great concern to me and to many people, but it's also a source of hope on a variety of measures. For example, there has to be a massive economic expansion in some ways and a massive rethinking. Is it going to be done in ways that promote the environment, that have a much greater impact on trying to reduce carbon emissions? I sincerely hope it does. I am concerned that some political leaders who aren't very interested in the environment will not use it for that benefit. But it is at least a great possibility. It's an opportunity that could be taken. Because governments are spending such vast sums trying to mitigate the economic catastrophe that so many of the richer countries of the world are suffering, the temptation will be to ignore what's going on outside those rich countries. And I think that would be extremely short-sighted, because we believe that the true impact isn't going to be this year. It's going to be 2021, maybe even 2022 in many parts of the world, where countries that simply have no health capacity to deal with the pandemic, where social distancing is seen as a luxury, where people who have to work every day to be able to survive cannot afford the luxury of social distancing. For those of us in the West, it's easy for us not to think too much about that, or to consider that there will be, likely to be, a great growth of instability and violent conflict in many parts of the world. So now is not the time to cut back, and this is one of the points that I'm making in my position as head of the Berghof Foundation, which works on conflict resolution in many parts of the world, including those that are likely to be the worst hit by the pandemic itself, as well as the secondary impact, both in terms of the economic catastrophe and also rise of war and conflict. So it is, I think, it's absolutely essential that governments continue to, such as ours and other rich countries, continue to invest in peacemaking and development assistance and healthcare in the parts of the world that are likely to be the most impacted by it, and where the number of people most vulnerable can be counted in hundreds of millions. So this is a major priority, not to just focus on our own problems, as enormous as they seem at the moment, but to understand that there are far greater ones outside the rich countries, and that these will come back to bite us if we don't deal with them. They will come back to bite us in terms of a growth of radical extremism. They will come back in terms of instability, and they will come back in terms of increased migration to places such as the UK and elsewhere in Europe and the United States. I realize that a lot of what I'm saying doesn't sound very optimistic, but I certainly am not devoid of hope. First of all, I would say that today's youth is much more galvanized than youths of my generation were, I would say, particularly in the area of dealing with climate change. And I would hope that we will see the engagement of today's youth also focus on human rights issues. But Black Lives Matter and the totally, in my view, understandable reaction to the incessant police brutality that takes place in the United States, that has just become a little bit more obvious now because there are so many people can upload individual incidents of it. But the reaction and the revulsion towards one particular killing, but then a whole bunch of others as well, has, I think, led to a window of hope there, that people will finally come to grips with the police brutality that is so based on racism and a sense of impunity that they will never get punished, because of the power of the police unions always does everything to ensure that however great a policeman's crime is, or a prison warder's crime is, they will somehow be got off, because the relevant unions will prevent any action being taken against them. So there are areas of optimism, and I would say the sort of the feelings provoked by police brutality into reducing racism in many aspects of society is an area of hope. It is not directly related to COVID, it just happens to have taken place during the pandemic. But that is an area where I do have a significant feelings of hope. Culture has a vital role to play, and culture ministers can really try to help to break down some of the animus in society and to increase social cohesion. As we have seen in different places, culture can either increase social cohesion or it can help to fracture it. I'm not saying culture ministers should tell artists what to do, but there are certainly ways that can be found to encourage artists to do more, to show the plight of victims, the plight of victims of injustice, and of racism and of police brutality, for example, and those who are just disadvantaged by the justice system. Another way it would be to continually encourage artists to look at other communities from their own and to see that these are people that not only can we live with them, but these other communities have a lot to offer us and a lot to learn from them. So getting people together in orchestras or film festivals or in online magazines to promote tolerance and coexistence is an area where culture ministers can really try to improve matters.